Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where a woman's worth could be measured not by her laughter, her wit, or her ambitions, but by the invisible weight of a concept called purity. Imagine yourself standing in a smoky medieval hall where torches sputter against damp stone and whispers coil through the rafters. The air is heavy, not with incense, but with judgment. Everyone's gaze could turn on you in an instant, not because of a crime you committed, but because of something you might or might not have done in secret. You probably won't survive this kind of pressure, but let's tread gently through it together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into history with a quiet awareness that purity was once more than a private matter. It was a form of currency. In the courts of Europe, a daughter's chastity could elevate her family, seal political treaties, or secure a dowry worth entire estates. The belief was simple, if not cruel. A woman unsullied was an asset, a woman suspected was a liability. Entire dynasties hinged on this invisible ledger, one no man had to balance in the same way. Historians still argue whether societies were more obsessed with controlling women's sexuality than men's, simply because of inheritance laws, or if deeper psychological fears drove it. But one thing remains clear: purity was stitched tightly into the fabric of honor. You weren't just yourself, you carried your family's reputation in your body, and the tension of that could follow you like a shadow at dawn. Consider the mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, noble families arranged marriages less for affection and more for alliances. A pure daughter could mean the difference between acquiring a duchy or losing it to rivals. Marriage was a chessboard, and virginity was the queen's hidden strength. Without it, the board could collapse. On the quirkier side, there were odd traditions to protect purity, some as bizarre as giving girls belts adorned with charms against temptation or bathing them in rosewater, thought to close the body against sin. A folk belief in parts of rural Germany claimed eating certain herbs, like agrimony, could seal virtue. Science, of course, never backed that up, but families clung to these talismans like a flimsy insurance policy. The double standard was obvious, though probably not discussed aloud in those great halls. A young man could sow his oats, win glory in tournaments, and still return to marry well. A young woman had one fragile thread tying her to her fate. Break it, or even appear to, and her entire world could unravel. You might picture the anxiety of girls tucked away in towers, not just for safety from invaders, but from rumors. A single whisper could undo years of careful grooming for marriage. Think of how gossip works today, just faster with Wi-Fi and hashtags. Back then, it spread through markets and monasteries, but the result was the same. Reputations crumbled on hearsay. Even royalty wasn't immune. Monarchs demanded proof, demanded assurances, demanded their brides arrive untouched. You can imagine the pressure at a wedding feast, the hush that fell when the newlyweds disappeared behind a curtain, and the curiosity about what the sheets might reveal by morning. That curiosity, by the way, wasn't just private chatter, it was state business. It's easy now, curled under your blanket, to see how absurd it was. But to them, purity wasn't just symbolic, it was wealth, politics and power, compacted into a fragile idea that could never be fully proved, and yet was endlessly tested. That's the cruel paradox you carry forward as we continue. Something intangible wielded the force of law. And so as you drift deeper, you can almost hear the unsteady breath of a bride pacing in her chamber, knowing her fate isn't in her hands but in the imaginations of others. The hall waits, the family waits, the kingdom waits, and you, standing silently in the corner of history, see how every glance toward her isn't admiration but evaluation. You might not expect this, but the most private act in life was once turned into public theatre. Imagine a great hall the morning after a wedding, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows, beams of light catching on goblets left half empty from the feast. The revelers may be nursing headaches, but their attention shifts toward one thing only, the bridal bed. The idea was simple in theory, grotesque in practice. The union had to be consummated, and proof of a bride's virginity was expected to show itself in a crimson stain on white sheets. Yes, entire families, or worse, entire courts, waited for those linens to be paraded like a victory banner. A young couple's intimacy, or lack thereof, could literally be displayed as evidence in front of gossiping relatives and opportunistic rivals. Mainstream history gives us plenty of examples. In France, the 16th century court sometimes held what they coyly called a public bedding ceremony, where nobles would escort the couple to their chamber and even tuck them in, as if purity were a community project. The door would close, but not the curiosity. Hours later, the sheets could be examined for proof that the bride had been untouched before marriage. Imagine your honeymoon, starting with an audience rating your performance. That's less romantic getaway and more worst reality TV show ever. Of course, historians still argue whether every single noble marriage demanded this ritual or whether it was more symbolic. Some records describe full-blown inspections, while others suggest it was more about creating theatre to silence rumours. Either way, the humiliation for women was the same, their privacy dissolved under the weight of tradition. Now for the quirky tidbit. If the sheets weren't stained enough, or at all, families had tricks. Animal blood, pricked fingers, even pre-prepared cloths could stand in as false evidence. In fact, there are tales of chambermaids who doubled as emergency suppliers of proof. One Dutch folktale even describes a bride slipping a tiny vial of pigeon blood into her sleeve, just in case. Practical? Yes. Romantic? Absolutely not. The pressure was suffocating. Picture yourself as that bride, knowing a kingdom's alliances might teeter on whether your bedsheet looked convincing. Even if love existed between you and your husband, the act itself wasn't about tenderness, it was about evidence. You weren't proving devotion, you were proving utility. And what about the groom? Strangely enough, his performance mattered far less. A groom could be clumsy, nervous, or even incapable, but blame usually fell on the bride if the right result wasn't achieved. The double standard was glaring. You see the absurdity. The man was applauded for marrying. The woman was interrogated for existing. One story from Spain tells of a marriage annulled when the bride's family couldn't produce satisfactory sheets. Whether the marriage had been consummated didn't matter. What mattered was the absence of a crimson mark. The annulment devastated her dowry, stained her name, and set her adrift in a society where second chances were rarer than hen's teeth. Imagine lying awake after such a night, heart pounding, not from passion, but from dread. Every creak of the wooden floorboards outside your chamber meant footsteps of witnesses, curious servants, or scheming relatives waiting to pounce. The bed itself wasn't a sanctuary, it was a stage, and you weren't a beloved partner, you were an exhibit. It's almost comical in hindsight, parading sheets like proof of conquest. But back then, it was deadly serious. Families lived or died on reputation, and purity was the currency exchanged at dawn. You, peeking from history's corner, realized this ritual wasn't about love at all. It was about control, spectacle, and the cruel demand that women perform purity on command. Ever wondered what passed for science when it came to proving virginity? Brace yourself, it wasn't microscopes or anatomy textbooks. It was, quite literally, fingers. The so-called two-finger test was one of the most invasive, humiliating, and entirely unscientific methods women endured to demonstrate their so-called purity. Picture a cold chamber, perhaps in a medieval castle or even a small rural village, where a woman suspected of impurity was summoned. She'd stand before matrons, midwives, or sometimes physicians, and the ritual would unfold. The examiner's job? To insert two fingers and declare whether the bride passed the test of tightness and resistance? No consent, no dignity, just the pressure of family honor pressing down like the stone walls around her. The mainstream fact here is that by the late Middle Ages, midwives were sometimes required by courts to conduct virginity examinations. They weren't just assisting with childbirth, they were pulled into the legal theatre of purity, asked to swear oaths about what their fingers told them. It sounds absurd now, but their word could determine whether a marriage stood or fell, whether dowries changed hands, or whether a woman was cast out in shame. Historians still argue whether the two-finger test originated in medieval Europe or whether it was codified later in the colonial period, but evidence of its practice stretches across cultures. In many places it wasn't just about brides. It could be inflicted on women accused of adultery, sex work, or even witchcraft. In other words, it became a catch-all weapon against women, a way to police behavior through pseudoscience. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Some examiners actually claimed they could tell not only if a woman was a virgin, but whether she had been with just one man or many. How? By the supposed elasticity of the body. Spoiler alert, the human body doesn't work like a medieval drawstring bag. But these examiners delivered judgments with all the confidence of a modern influencer selling miracle supplements. And the consequences were staggering. A failed test meant disgrace, annulment, or worse. Imagine walking into a marriage negotiation and realizing your entire value boiled down to whether someone else's fingers gave a thumbs up or thumbs down. That's not just invasive, that's a whole medieval Yelp review with life or death stakes. Some records even suggest women prepared defenses against the test. Certain folk remedies promised to tighten the body, from herbal poultices to vinegar rinses. A Roman medical text claimed alum, a mineral, could restore youthful closure. It's doubtful these remedies worked, but the desperation to control outcomes shows how much terror the test inspired. You can almost feel the coldness of that moment, the silence in the room, the weight of judgment, the eyes fixed on a woman's face as someone else claimed authority over her future. Even if the examiner was sympathetic, the act itself stripped away all dignity. You weren't a person with hopes or fears. You were a specimen, a problem to be solved by hands that had no business being there. The cruel irony? Men faced no equivalent ordeal. Their fidelity, their experience, their body, none of it was subjected to ritual scrutiny. Purity was a one-way street, and you were the one forced to walk it barefoot. So here you are, drifting further into the history of these ordeals, realizing that the so-called science of the time was nothing more than cultural control dressed up in ritual. And as the shadows of that chamber fade in your mind, you sense the echo of injustice stretching centuries forward, whispering that some myths are stubborn, even when truth is obvious. You might think witch trials were all about cauldrons, black cats, and muttered spells. But tucked inside those frenzied accusations was another cruel obsession: purity. When women were dragged before inquisitors in early modern Europe, their supposed chastity, or lack of it, was often part of the evidence marshalled against them. Picture the scene: a damp stone chamber, candlelight flickering across rough-hewn tables piled with parchment. A group of stern-faced men leans forward, quills poised, while a trembling woman stands accused. Her neighbours have whispered that she's too independent, too outspoken, or simply unlucky enough to have a cow die in her field. The charge? Witchcraft. But woven into the interrogation is a quieter, more insidious question: was she pure? Mainstream history reminds us that in the 15th through 17th centuries, virginity was often equated with holiness. Women who defied that image, widows, midwives, or simply those living outside male control, were more vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. If a woman had children outside wedlock or even rumors of impropriety, the court could fold her supposed impurity into the case against her. The logic went something like: if she wasn't chaste, she must be consorting with the devil. Convenient if you wanted an easy scapegoat. Historians still argue whether inquisitors truly believed these women had sexual congress with demons, or whether the lurid testimonies were just tools to terrify communities into obedience. Either way, purity was weaponized. Questions about intimacy became twisted into proof of diabolical activity. If you were too pure, you were suspiciously saintly. If you weren't pure enough, you were marked as corrupted. It was a no-win situation. And now here's a quirky tidbit. Some witch hunters believed they could find a witch's mark on the body, supposedly left by the devil during intercourse. These marks were often nothing more than birthmarks, scars, or even freckles. Women were stripped and prodded while examiners searched their skin like they were reading tea leaves. One 17th century Scottish pamphlet even boasted that examiners could identify a witch because her nether parts felt unnaturally cold, a claim that's about as scientific as declaring someone guilty because they sneezed on a Tuesday. Imagine the humiliation. After days of torture or threats, women were subjected to examinations that blurred the line between superstition and cruelty. And unlike the earlier bridal bed tests, these weren't just about family honor. They were about survival. Fail the test, and you could face drowning, hanging, or the stake. The theatre of purity in witch trials reveals something darker. Society's deep fear of women whose bodies weren't under male control. A midwife who knew herbs, a widow who owned land, a young woman who refused marriage, all could be branded impure in ways that conveniently aligned with charges of witchcraft. And here's the bitter joke history hands us. Some accused women were even forced to undergo the two-finger test you just walked through in Section 3. Purity and witchcraft became tangled threads, both used to tie women down. Imagine enduring the invasive humiliation of a virginity test, only to be told the result was evidence that you'd made a pact with Satan. So you stand again in that candlelit chamber, listening as accusations swirl and quills scratch. You see how purity was never just personal, it was political, spiritual, and deeply manipulative. And as the voices of inquisitors fade in your ears, you feel the creeping unease of a truth too many women knew. When purity becomes a test, the rules are rigged, so you can never really win. You might not expect a river to double as a courtroom, but for centuries, water was judge, jury, and executioner. The ordeal of cold water was one of the harshest ways women were tested, not only for witchcraft, but also at times for purity and virtue. Imagine standing barefoot on a muddy bank at dawn, surrounded by a crowd holding its breath, while officials prepare to throw you into the current. The logic was twisted but simple. Pure women, or the innocent, depending on the accusation, would sink, embraced by the water. Impure women, by contrast, would float, rejected by the very element meant to cleanse. The irony? Sink too well and you risk drowning, float too well and you're branded guilty. It was a cruel catch-22, and either way, you were left gasping for air. Mainstream history gives us chilling examples. During the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, courts in Central Europe used this test to determine guilt. Bound with ropes, women were tossed into lakes or rivers while villagers watched. If they floated, it was said they were lightened by the devil. If they sank, they were innocent, but often too dead to enjoy their exoneration. The ordeal wasn't limited to witches either. In earlier medieval contexts, versions of water trials were used to settle disputes about honor, including a woman's chastity. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed in the metaphysics of water rejecting impurity, or whether it was more about spectacle and fear. After all, once a crowd gathers to watch a neighbor flail in freezing water, belief becomes secondary to the theater of control. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some German villages, ropes were tied with a special knot said to ensure God's decision. If the knot slipped and the accused sank quickly, the crowd shrugged. Apparently, God had spoken through bad rope work. In Poland, one recorded case even mentioned tying women under their armpits rather than their waists, because people thought waist ropes unfairly helped them sink. Medieval fairness had its own bizarre logic. Imagine the sensory details, the water bites like knives against your skin, your lungs seize in shock, and the muffled roar of the crowd echoes in your ears as you thrash. You aren't fighting the devil, you're fighting hypothermia. And above you, faces lean forward in fascination, waiting for the verdict of bubbles. Of course, men were occasionally subjected to the ordeal of water too, but women bore the brunt, especially when purity was in question. A bride suspected of dishonor might be marched to a stream to prove herself in front of relatives. The ordeal left no room for nuance. It turned human dignity into a wager against nature. And the cruelest twist? Survivors weren't celebrated. If you lived through the ordeal, it meant you floated, which meant guilt. If you drowned, well, congratulations, you were innocent after all. Imagine trying to explain that logic to someone today. Good news, she sank like a stone. Bad news, she's gone. You can almost hear the rippling water settle after each trial, as though the river itself sighed in exhaustion. And as you stand at the edge of history's riverbank, you sense the weight of centuries where purity wasn't a private matter, but something to be tested in public, with water as the merciless witness. You might not expect a piece of fabric to carry so much weight, but for centuries, veils, gowns, and modest clothing were treated as silent witnesses to a woman's virtue. Imagine standing in a medieval square where sunlight glints off embroidered hems, and you can feel eyes measuring not just your outfit, but your morality. To them, fabric wasn't fashion, it was evidence. In many cultures, the way you dressed was believed to reveal your purity. A veil pulled low over the brow suggested chastity. A gown cut too wide at the neckline could invite scandal. Families fussed endlessly over sleeves, hems, and head coverings, as though thread and wool could stand in for a hymen. Your virtue, in their eyes, wasn't in your character. It was stitched into seams. Mainstream history shows us this was especially true in medieval Europe, where sumptuary laws regulated clothing to reinforce class and gender roles. In Florence, for example, young unmarried women were expected to wear plain dresses and full veils in public. Too much lace, too much colour, and you risked being labelled impure. Purity wasn't tested just in bedchambers or rivers. It was tested every time you walked into the street. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about morality or more about controlling women and maintaining social hierarchies. After all, what better way to keep daughters under watch than by making their very clothing a public announcement of their status? Some scholars suggest these virtue codes were as much about protecting family reputations as about personal piety. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some parts of the Ottoman Empire, women wore talismanic shirts under their gowns, embroidered with Quranic verses or magical symbols. These weren't just for luck, they were meant to guard chastity, as though a stitched prayer could so shut temptation. Meanwhile, in Renaissance England, there are records of young women wearing rosemary sprigs pinned discreetly into their bodices. Why? Because rosemary was thought to repel lustful advances. Forget pepper spray, herbs were the medieval self-defense kit. But these veils and garments could also betray you. A stained hem, a ripped sleeve, or a loosened veil might spark whispers that you had been careless with your virtue. The tiniest wardrobe malfunction could spiral into social disaster. You weren't just dressing for the day, you were testifying to your purity with every button and pin. Imagine the suffocating weight of it. You're not free to feel the breeze in your hair because uncovered locks might invite temptation. You're not free to dance too freely at a feast because swishing skirts could be read as suggestive. Even colours spoke. White symbolized maidenhood, but a hint of red in your gown might trigger accusations of carnality. Forget Fashion Week, this was Morality Week, every week, and yet some women resisted quietly. Records tell of girls sneaking ribbons of forbidden colours under their sleeves, or tilting veils just enough to let a rival know they weren't as docile as expected. Those tiny acts of rebellion, invisible to history's grand narratives, flicker like sparks in the dark. As you drift deeper into this world of fabric and suspicion, you realize the veil wasn't just cloth, it was a purity test you wore every day. And as the rustle of imagined skirts fades, you hear the whispers of women through time, adjusting their gowns with trembling hands, knowing that for them, fashion wasn't freedom. It was surveillance. You might not expect sainthood to be bound up with virginity, but for centuries, tales of virgin martyrs filled the air like incense. Imagine sitting in a candlelit chapel, listening to monks chant stories of girls so pure, so untouched, that their refusal to yield became legendary. Their purity wasn't just personal, it was propaganda, wielded as proof that divine power lived in chastity. The mainstream fact here is clear. Many early Christian saints, especially women, were celebrated not for miracles of healing or scholarship, but for dying to preserve their virginity. Saint Agnes, martyred in Rome at age 13, was praised for refusing marriage and protecting her purity unto death. Saint Lucy of Syracuse met a similar fate, eyes gouged out in grisly legends, yet remembered primarily as a virgin martyr. Their tales reinforced the idea that a woman's highest calling wasn't wisdom or leadership, but guarding a fragile notion of untouched innocence. Historians still argue whether these stories were based on actual events or shaped by clerics who needed role models for female obedience. Some scholars believe the tales were exaggerated or even invented to provide powerful teaching tools. After all, what better way to keep young women in line than by holding up saints who supposedly defied all temptation and were glorified for it? And here's the quirky tidbit. One legend claims Saint Agnes's hair miraculously grew long enough, in an instant, to cover her nakedness when she was stripped for humiliation. Imagine that, divine modesty extensions centuries before hair salons and clip-ins. Another tale insists Saint Cecilia's purity was so radiant that when an executioner tried 3 times to behead her, his sword simply refused to work properly. Divine protection or a very nervous swordsman? The records are a little fuzzy. The point of these stories was simple. Purity equaled power. Communities repeated them in hushed tones, carved them into stained glass, and painted them onto church walls. The message to young women sitting in pews was clear. Your worth lies in resisting, in staying untouched, no matter the cost. Even martyrdom was preferable to losing virtue. Imagine the weight of that message as a girl of 12 or 13. You're not being told to dream of love or learning. You're being told to prepare to die, if necessary, just to keep others from saying you've been defiled. The hymns you hear aren't lullabies, they're warnings. And yet, the irony lingers. Men who became saints were praised for preaching, fighting, or founding monasteries. Women, on the other hand, were often reduced to their hymens. Their sanctity was tied to their chastity, their holiness to their untouched bodies. Even when carved into marble or painted in gold leaf, their stories were less about faith and more about fear. Still, for all the manipulation, the stories carried glimmers of defiance. Many virgin martyrs were portrayed as refusing powerful suitors, kings or pagan officials. In their refusal, you hear echoes of rebellion against patriarchal demands. They may have been turned into symbols, but behind the symbols were human beings saying no when everyone demanded yes. So you drift further into the candlelight, hearing the chants echo against the stone. These saints' voices, whether real or imagined, remind you that purity was never just a private matter. It was a weapon, a lesson, a story told again and again to keep women's lives under scrutiny. And as the flames flicker, you realize the cruelest part. Even in death, they were still being tested. You might not expect one tiny piece of anatomy to shape so much destiny, yet for centuries the hymen was treated like a courtroom witness. Picture yourself in a dim chamber with shuttered windows where nervous parents whisper, midwives wait with folded hands, and a bride's entire future is said to hinge on a thin fold of tissue no bigger than a coin. The mainstream fact is this. By the Middle Ages, the hymen had already taken on symbolic weight far beyond its biology. Doctors of the time believed it was a veil of virginity, an unbroken seal marking purity. Some claimed that only penetration could rupture it, ignoring the countless ways it could change naturally, through exercise, accidents, or simply existing. Yet families clung to the myth, demanding that midwives or physicians inspect it before declaring a girl fit for marriage. Historians still argue whether this focus on the hymen came from genuine ignorance of female anatomy or deliberate control over women's bodies. After all, early medical texts were written almost entirely by men, often copying centuries-old mistakes from Greek and Roman sources. The body became less a subject of study and more a battlefield of morality. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some cultures went as far as inventing tests that sound like something from a surreal play. In Renaissance Italy, one midwife wrote that she would place a feather at the entrance of the bride's body. If the feather stopped at the barrier, she declared her pure. Another tradition in North Africa suggested inserting wool dipped in oil. If it came back unstained, the hymen was intact. Science? Not even close. Theatre? Absolutely. The cruel irony is that the hymen doesn't behave the way people thought. Some women are born with very little tissue, some with flexible folds that stretch, some with none at all. Yet failure to display an unbroken hymen could mean annulment, disgrace, or exile. Imagine being judged for a map drawn on your body without your consent, where the borders are invisible but the penalties are lethal. The obsession ran so deep that apothecaries sold potions and powders said to restore virginity. Alum and myrrh were common ingredients, applied in painful rituals designed to tighten the body. By the 18th century, travelling salesmen hawked sponges or artificial membranes filled with animal blood, an early, desperate version of stagecraft for the bridal bed. The hymen wasn't just anatomy, it was a market. And what about the medical men? Some insisted they could detect the difference between a true virgin and a false one by the hymen's shape, cataloguing types with the seriousness of butterfly collectors. Circular, crescent, cribiform. They gave names, drew diagrams, and wrote manuals, all while ignoring the fundamental truth. None of it proved a thing. Imagine lying on a wooden table, the smell of herbs and waxy candles in the air, while strangers leaned over you debating the state of your tissue like jurors over evidence. Your voice didn't matter, the hymen spoke louder, even though it said nothing at all. And here you sit now, centuries later, realizing that this tiny fold became a symbol carrying the weight of dynasties, dowries, and entire lives. The myths clung so tightly that even today, echoes remain in conversations about virginity. The hymen, once a scapegoat, still casts its long shadow. You might not expect money to mingle so directly with morality, but in the world of arranged marriages, dowries and purity were practically glued together. Imagine a great oak table where parchment contracts lie beside silver coins, bolts of silk and perhaps a small chest of jewels. A father leans forward, quill in hand, but in truth the ink is already dry because the true condition of the bargain is not the gold on the table but the reputation of his daughter's virginity. The mainstream fact is this: across medieval Europe, South Asia and the Middle East, dowries weren't just gifts. They were financial lifelines, land, livestock, or coin meant to secure alliances between families. But if whispers spread that the bride wasn't pure, the entire agreement could unravel overnight. There are court records from France in the 14th century describing dowries being clawed back when a woman's honor was called into question. Families didn't just lose money, they lost face, power, and standing in their communities. Historians still argue whether these annulments were genuinely about purity or whether purity served as a convenient excuse for families who regretted the match. After all, if a groom's side wanted to escape obligations, all it took was a rumor whispered in the right ear. She was not untouched. Convenient scapegoat, convenient financial out. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some Italian city-states, contracts actually included purity clauses. If the bride was discovered not to be a virgin, the groom's family could demand double repayment of the dowry. One Florentine merchant in the 15th century even tried to ensure his daughter's purity, literally purchasing a contract with a notary that would protect his money if she were found wanting. Imagine that, medieval virginity insurance, as if your daughter were a shipment of cargo crossing pirate waters. The ripple effects were cruel. For a young woman, the loss of dowry because of suspected impurity often meant she could not marry at all, as no family wanted to risk damaged goods. Without marriage, she lost her chance at financial stability, property rights, and in many cases, social safety. She wasn't just dishonored, she was economically stranded. Picture the atmosphere in a household when such rumors spread. The mother scolds the daughter for being seen speaking to a neighbor boy. The father paces the hall, calculating how much silver could be lost if the betrothal collapsed. Brothers mutter about family shame. And all the while, the girl herself sits silently, knowing she cannot disprove a whisper that travels faster than any truth. Some families, desperate to protect investments, staged elaborate proof rituals. They bribed servants to confirm the success of the wedding night, doctored sheets, or, in some cases, hired midwives to publicly swear to a girl's purity before the marriage took place. It was a circus of performance, all to safeguard a chest of coins or a plot of land, and yet there were occasional glimmers of subversion. Stories survive of clever brides who smuggled fake blood onto sheets, or of sympathetic servants who swore loyalty to their mistress even in the face of suspicion. In those small rebellions, you can hear echoes of resistance against a system that equated women with banknotes. So here you sit, tracing the outline of that oak table in your imagination, hearing the scratch of quills and the clink of coins. You realize that for centuries, purity wasn't just about morality, it was about property, profit, and the relentless entangling of a woman's body with her family's fortune. And as the candlelight flickers across the imagined parchment, you sense the cruelest irony. Even in matters of money, women had no real currency of their own. You might not expect royal palaces, those glittering halls of marble, silk and ceremony, to tremble over something as fragile as a rumour, but dynasties could rise or fall on a princess's purity. Imagine yourself drifting through a candlelit corridor of Versailles or the Tower of London, where every whisper echoes twice, bouncing off gilded ceilings and stone walls alike. Behind the velvet curtains, families weren't just protecting jewels and crowns, they were guarding secrets, sometimes scandalous, sometimes desperate. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were treaties stitched together with lace and politics, each union meant to cement alliances or strengthen claims to thrones. A king might forgive a cousin's betrayal, but never a bride's suspected impurity. If a princess entered her marriage without proof of virginity, treaties could unravel, wars could erupt, and entire kingdoms could teeter into chaos. Historians still argue whether some famous royal scandals were exaggerated for political ends. Take Anne of Brittany, whose 2 marriages to French kings required her reputation to remain spotless, lest rival nobles pounce, or Catherine of Aragon, who famously swore that her marriage to Arthur, Henry VIII's brother, was never consummated, a claim on which England's entire divorce crisis later turned. Was she telling the truth? Historians still debate, but what matters here is that a queen's word carried less weight than the politics pressing down upon her. Here's the quirky tidbit. When Marie Antoinette of France failed to conceive quickly after her marriage to Louis XV, pamphleteers whispered that perhaps she hadn't been pure to begin with. One particularly nasty rumour claimed her hymen was so tough that surgeons had to intervene. Whether true or not, it shows how royal bedrooms were dissected in gossip as if the public had front-row seats. It was less monarchy, more soap opera, except the stakes were armies, not ratings. And when secrecy was required, palaces became stage managers of deception. Bedchambers were patrolled by servants sworn to silence. Midwives and physicians were bribed to declare purity. Sheets were smuggled or doctored. In some cases, entire cover stories were fabricated. One Spanish princess was rumoured to have undergone a staged marriage night, with blood discreetly prepared on linens, because failure would have shattered a critical alliance. Imagine an empire hinging on a maid's carefully spilled vial of animal blood. For the women caught in these scandals, the pressure was suffocating. They were daughters of empires, yet powerless to defend themselves against whispers. A prince's drunken fumbling, an heir's impotence, or a king's political anxieties could all be twisted into accusations against the bride. Even if she was blameless, her name became a chess piece. And the cruelest part? Royal women had fewer chances of escape than commoners. Divorce, or annulment, was public spectacle. Annulment often required papal approval, and exile left them as pawns to be shuffled across Europe. Elizabeth of Valois, sent to Spain, was praised for her purity. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's ill-fated young queen, was executed for her alleged lack of it. Same test, different verdicts, because politics, not truth, decided outcomes. Picture yourself now at a royal wedding feast. Musicians play, nobles toast, And beneath the laughter you feel the undercurrent of calculation. Every smile hides suspicion, every glass of wine cloaks anxiety. Behind the brocade and velvet, a young woman knows that one mistake or one false rumor could topple nations. Her veil may shimmer in candlelight, but it's less ornament than armor. And as you step silently back from the banquet table, you realize the irony. The richest women in the world, draped in jewels, were often the most trapped. For all the crowns and scepters, their bodies were still subjected to the same cruel tests as the peasant girl by the river. Only here the consequences were continental. You might not expect it, but one of history's most infamous symbols of purity, the chastity belt, wasn't quite what legend makes it out to be. Picture a dim medieval armory, racks of swords and helmets gleaming in torchlight, and right there on the wall, a strange contraption of iron and leather, locked and buckled in the most uncomfortable places. For centuries, whispers claimed that fathers, husbands, and kings used these devices to protect women's virtue when they were away. The reality, though, is messier and a little less metallic. The mainstream fact is that most historians now agree chastity belts were largely symbolic, satirical, or outright fabricated much later. The earliest supposed references in the 15th century look more like moral warnings than actual instructions. Renaissance engravings show belts as part of bawdy jokes, not daily attire. Actual surviving metal belts, once thought medieval, were often 19th century fakes, sold to curious collectors or displayed in museums to shock tourists. Historians still argue whether a handful of belts may have been used in specific, short-term contexts. A few records describe contraptions designed to deter assault during travel, but nothing suggests long-term imprisonment of wives in iron underwear. The logistics alone, hygiene, infections, and the small issue of eating and moving make it unlikely. Imagine being asked to wear a locked iron diaper for years. Even the most controlling lord would eventually prefer clean laundry to constant rust. Now for the quirky tidbit. One satirical poem from Italy joked about a knight who gifted his wife a chastity belt before leaving for war, only to realize he had forgotten the key halfway down the road. In another tale, a locksmith supposedly made a small fortune selling duplicate keys to impatient wives. These stories were comedy, not chronicles, but they reveal how the very idea of locking women's bodies became fodder for both fear and laughter. Still, the myth stuck. By the Victorian era, chastity belts were reimagined as grim relics of medieval cruelty. Museums displayed them under glass with solemn labels, thrilling visitors with the idea that women once jingled like walking padlocks. Only later did scholars uncover that many of those medieval belts had actually been welded together centuries after the fact. The cruelty wasn't in the hardware, it was in the belief that such control was plausible, even desirable. But don't relax too much. The obsession with controlling women's sexuality didn't vanish just because the belt itself was a myth. Symbolically, it carried enormous weight. Writers used it to illustrate the extreme lengths men would go to preserve purity. For women, the idea was terrifying. Your body reduced to property. Your autonomy locked away like a castle gate. Imagine yourself walking through one of those 19th century exhibitions, peering at a rusted iron contraption behind glass. The crowd around you gasps, murmurs about the barbarism of the Middle Ages. And yet you realize the real barbarism isn't the belt at all. It's the centuries of surveillance and suspicion that made the belt such a believable story. So as the imagined iron fades from your mind, you're left with the quiet truth. The chastity belt, whether real in rare instances or mostly myth, symbolized the same old test. Women's purity, once again, was imagined as something that had to be guarded, locked, and proven, not something they owned outright. You might not expect glowing coals or boiling water to play a role in proving a woman's purity, yet for centuries, trial by fire was considered a legitimate test. Imagine yourself standing in a crowded churchyard where villagers crane their necks, priests chant prayers, and a trembling young woman is handed a red-hot iron bar. The logic was twisted but clear. If she carried it a set number of paces without her skin blistering, or if her hand healed clean within days, God had marked her as pure and innocent. The mainstream fact is that ordeals by fire or boiling water were part of medieval trial by ordeal, sanctioned by courts and church alike. A woman accused of impurity, adultery, or witchcraft might be commanded to plunge her arm into a cauldron of bubbling water, retrieve a stone from the bottom, and then wait under bandages while priests examined the wound. If it healed smoothly, she was exonerated. If it festered, she was guilty. It sounds horrifying now, but to many communities this was seen as divine arbitration. Historians still argue whether priests secretly manipulated these tests to ensure outcomes. Some evidence suggests that fires were cooled, irons lightly heated, or cauldrons prepared in ways that gave favored defendants a chance at survival. Others argue the opposite, that authorities wanted guilty verdicts and stacked the odds. Either way, the miracle was less in the hand of God and more in the hands of the officiants. Here's the quirky tidbit. In one 12th century German case, a woman accused of adultery was told to walk blindfolded barefoot across 9 red-hot plowshares. According to legend, she emerged unscathed, and her accusers were forced to apologize. Was it divine protection, clever trickery, or the medieval equivalent of a stage illusion? No one can say, but the story spread like wildfire, turning her ordeal into a strange kind of victory parade. Imagine the sensory detail. The acrid scent of smoke curling from the iron, the heat searing your skin before you even touch it, the murmurs of the crowd as you stretch out trembling fingers. Every nerve screams at you to drop the bar, yet you force yourself forward, praying that pain will be interpreted as innocence. The irony is suffocating. Blisters are treated as sin, scars as shame, yet endurance somehow counts as proof of purity. And if you failed? The consequences were brutal. A festering wound could mean exile, annulment, or even death. Worse still, failing the ordeal meant your family's honor was scorched too. Their wealth, alliances, and standing might crumble with the skin on your palm. It's difficult not to smirk at the absurdity, even as you shiver at its cruelty. Imagine telling someone today, "To prove you're faithful, please grab this hot skillet and hold it for 10 seconds. They'd laugh you out of the kitchen, but centuries ago this was deadly serious. The idea that God would intervene to shield the innocent gave fire and boiling water the weight of divine judgment. So you stand, drifting in the smoke of history, hearing the crackle of flames and the gasps of villagers. And as you back away from the heat, you realize trial by fire wasn't really about truth at all. It was theater, spectacle, and a way to make purity a public performance etched into flesh. You might not expect it, but the question of who got to verify a woman's purity sparked turf wars between midwives and medical men. Picture yourself in a shadowy chamber in the late Middle Ages. A young bride sits nervously on a stool, her mother wrings her hands in the corner, and at the center of it all, 2 figures stand stiffly, the village midwife with decades of experience and a physician fresh from a university, both claiming authority over what only the woman herself should own. The mainstream fact is that by the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe began to professionalize medicine. Universities trained men in Latin texts, often written by Galen or Hippocrates centuries earlier, while midwives, usually older women, relied on practical knowledge passed down through generations. When questions of purity arose, courts often called midwives to examine brides, but as male physicians gained prestige, they tried to wrest control of these examinations. The battleground wasn't just about health, it was about power. Historians still argue whether midwives truly defended women from the harshest intrusions, or whether they enforced the same oppressive purity codes as the men. Some records praise midwives for protecting girls by declaring them sound, regardless of anatomy, while others suggest they participated willingly, eager to preserve their roles in the system. What's clear is that women's voices remained silent while others debated their worth. Here's the quirky tidbit. One medieval physician claimed he could identify a virgin by the tone of her voice. If it was high and clear, she was untouched. If it was low or husky, she was not. Another insisted that virginity could be proved by pouring wine into a woman's ear. If it dripped out of her mouth, she was pure. You don't need a medical degree to know that's nonsense, but back then it was published in serious texts. Imagine the tension in a household when a daughter's reputation was questioned. The mother might call for the trusted midwife who whispered reassurances, while the father demanded a physician with an official seal. The young bride herself sat powerless, her body the subject of professional rivalry. To her, it wasn't about whose opinion mattered more, it was that her body had become a prize in a tug of war. Even when no accusations hung in the air, the culture of surveillance persisted. Manuals circulated among medical men detailing supposed signs of virginity, while midwives swore oaths in front of magistrates to deliver impartial verdicts. The act of examination was wrapped in ceremony, but beneath the solemn language lay humiliation. You weren't a daughter or a wife, you were evidence. And yet, behind closed doors, some midwives offered quiet subversions. Folk stories tell of women who swore their clients pure, even when they knew otherwise, protecting them from annulment or shame. It was a small rebellion, hidden behind whispered oaths, but it offered a sliver of mercy in a system designed for cruelty. Imagine now the candle burning low in that chamber. The physician straightens his robes, the midwife tucks her apron, and both prepare to pronounce judgment. The young bride keeps her eyes on the floor, as if silence could shield her. And you, drifting unseen in the corner, realize this wasn't really medicine or midwifery. It was politics dressed in the language of science and tradition. You might not expect a goblet of wine or a bowl of milk to decide a woman's fate, but history is full of tales where potions and concoctions served as so-called tests of purity. Imagine sitting in a candle-lit chamber where anxious parents hover, a priest mutters blessings, and a nervous young woman is handed a chalice that may hold more than just herbs. It may hold her reputation. The mainstream fact is that in various cultures, women accused of impurity were sometimes forced to drink potions believed to reveal guilt or innocence. In medieval Europe, the ordeal of the chalice appeared in folklore and scattered records. A bitter brew of herbs, wine, or even animal blood was administered, and the woman was observed. If she vomited, fainted, or reacted strangely, the potion was said to have exposed her impurity. If she drank calmly, she was considered pure. Historians still argue whether these rituals were widespread judicial practices or mostly symbolic acts folded into local traditions. Some scholars think the so-called ordeal potions were less about medicine and more about intimidation, a way to terrify women into confessions or compliance. Others argue they may have been tied to older pagan customs of oath swearing, where drinking a sacred liquid bound you to truth. Here's the quirky tidbit. In one 15th century Bohemian tale, a bride suspected of impurity was forced to drink from a cup filled with goat's milk and honey. According to legend, if she had sinned, the mixture would curdle in her stomach. Another story from rural France involved a potion of wine mixed with powdered oak bark. Supposedly, an impure woman would be struck speechless after sipping it. Imagine a dinner party with that kind of beverage service. The ordeal was humiliating. Picture lifting the chalice to your lips, the liquid thick and sour, your heart racing not because of guilt, but because everyone in the room is staring, waiting for a sign. A single cough, a twitch of the hand, a drop spilled down your chin could spark murmurs. The potion itself didn't matter. What mattered was performance under pressure. And performance was everything. Families clung to these rituals as if they could erase doubt, when in truth, they created more. A girl who choked might be labelled ruined. One who drank calmly might still be whispered about later. No test was final because the real trial was in the gossip that followed. Ironically, some of these potions may have had real physiological effects. Bitter herbs like wormwood or rue could cause nausea or trembling. Spices like nutmeg and cinnamon could flush the cheeks. A girl reacting to a bitter brew wasn't guilty. She was just unlucky enough to be human. But try explaining that to an anxious crowd convinced that the chalice held truth itself. So you stand at the edge of that chamber, watching as the young woman swallows, her throat working, her eyes watering. Around her, the silence tightens like a noose. In the end, the chalice wasn't about purity at all. It was a prop, a tool to make women prove the unprovable. And as you step back from the scene, the echo of liquid swirling in the goblet lingers, a reminder that even something as simple as a sip could become a trial. You might not expect acres of farmland or crumbling castles to be tied to a woman's body, but purity was often the invisible lock on property rights. Imagine yourself in a drafty medieval hall where scribes scratch out charters, lords argue over borders, and at the center of it all stands a quiet young bride whose chastity determines whether land passes from one family to another. The mainstream fact is this: in many parts of Europe and beyond, inheritance laws linked a daughter's virginity directly to her family's ability to secure or transfer property. A pure bride brought legitimacy to a marriage alliance, meaning estates, vineyards, or whole villages could be safely merged under new ownership. If she was suspected of impurity, however, the deal could be voided, leaving land to languish in disputes or even seized by the crown. Her body, in essence, was the key that unlocked entire economies. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily designed to safeguard lineage or to exert broader control over women's lives. Some suggest purity clauses in property contracts were just excuses for powerful men to shuffle land as they pleased. Others argue communities truly believed impurity tainted inheritance itself, a superstition that made property as fragile as gossip. Here's the quirky tidbit. In one 14th century English case, a nobleman annulled his marriage by claiming his wife wasn't a virgin, and then argued in court that this invalidated the transfer of her dowry estate. The debate dragged on for years, involving everything from midwives' testimony to testimony about the bride's walk and demeanor. In the end, the land wound up in royal custody, proving the obvious. Purity tests often had less to do with virtue and more to do with who got the best real estate deal. Imagine the pressure in such households. A daughter wasn't just marrying for affection, she was carrying acres of farmland on her shoulders. Every neighbor's glance, every whispered rumor about a walk in the garden or a smile at a minstrel could jeopardize her family's claim. She might sit by the fire, embroidery in hand, but her thoughts weren't on stitches. They were on whether her body would be judged secure enough to secure the family's holdings. Some contracts even spelled this out. In parts of Italy, if a bride was found lacking, her dowry property had to be doubled back to the groom's family, essentially bankrupting her own. Imagine being a girl of 16, realizing your future wasn't just your own. It was tied to the soil your grandfather ploughed or the vineyards your mother walked at harvest. And the cruelest irony? Men's indiscretions had no bearing on property at all. A groom could parade mistresses openly, yet the family land remained safe. But one whisper about the bride, one failed test, and everything could collapse. The scales were not just uneven, they were nailed down on one side. So as you drift further into this hall of charters and seals, you can almost hear the scratch of quills turning private bodies into public contracts. Purity wasn't just about honor, it was about who got the orchards, the rivers, the rights to graze sheep. And as the torches sputter low, you realize women's dignity was often bartered as casually as land itself, caught in ledgers that weighed chastity heavier than coin. You might not expect amulets and whispered charms to be part of history's purity tests, but in villages and courts alike, folk magic promised to safeguard virginity, or expose its loss. Imagine a market square in the 15th century, stalls crowded with bundles of herbs, little carved trinkets and glass vials. A nervous mother leans in close to a wise woman selling charms, bargaining not for apples or salt, but for her daughter's reputation. The mainstream fact is that across medieval Europe and beyond, purity was often linked to protective magic. Families turned to amulets, spells and prayers stitched into cloth to ensure daughters entered marriage unblemished. Archaeologists have uncovered small talismanic rings inscribed with words like Virgo intacta, untouched maiden, and even belts embroidered with protective verses. These weren't worn for fashion. They were worn like invisible locks, talismans against suspicion. Historians still argue whether families truly believed these charms worked, or whether they were more about easing anxiety, like buying insurance you hope you'll never use. Some scholars suggest that purity charms were less about mystical protection and more about creating a visible sign of a family's seriousness, a way of saying, "We've done everything possible to preserve her honor." Here's the quirky tidbit. One German folk custom involved giving brides a pouch of dried frog bones to wear around their waist. Supposedly, if the bones rattled during the wedding procession, it meant the bride was still pure. Another odd practice in Eastern Europe used tiny cakes of wax inscribed with protective symbols, placed discreetly under the mattress on the wedding night. If the symbols melted without breaking, purity was said to be intact. It sounds more like a medieval baking show than a moral test. Imagine the pressure on a young bride as her family ties a charm around her neck or pins a sprig of rue into her bodice. The charm isn't just decoration, it's a public statement that her purity is guarded by forces beyond her control. And if anything went wrong, if the charm broke, if the herb wilted, whispers would begin. A charm meant to protect could just as easily betray. In some regions, women also sought out restoration magic. Recipes promised to renew maidenhood with mixtures of vinegar, alum, and myrtle applied in secret. Whether they worked didn't matter. What mattered was that the bride could say she had done her part, that she had invoked every possible spell to ensure a safe passage into marriage, and yet not all these charms were tools of fear. In quieter corners of history, they offered a kind of empowerment. A girl might keep a secret charm hidden in her apron pocket, not for her family's sake, but for her own. It gave her a sense of control in a world where she had little. In whispered prayers over herbs and symbols stitched into hems, you can hear the faint echoes of resistance. So you linger in that bustling marketplace, the scent of sage and rosemary in the air, charms clinking softly on tables. To the families buying them, purity was something fragile that needed magical reinforcement. To the girls wearing them, it was a burden disguised as a blessing. And as the voices of merchants fade, you realize purity wasn't only tested in rivers and bedsheets, it was tested in talismans that turned superstition into silent surveillance. You might not expect the hush of a confessional booth to double as a testing ground, yet for centuries, the church was one of the main arbiters of purity. Imagine yourself slipping into a dim chapel, the air thick with incense, candles flickering against gilded icons. A young woman kneels, her voice trembling through the lattice of the confessional, while a priest listens, quill in hand, ready to judge whether her soul, and sometimes her body, remains untainted. The mainstream fact is that medieval Christianity bound virginity tightly to holiness. The Church promoted purity as a virtue equal to faith itself, especially for women. Priests asked probing questions during confession, sometimes steering dangerously close to intrusive interrogations. In certain regions, young brides were even required to swear before the altar that they entered marriage untainted, their oath treated as binding testimony. Holy relics, too, were invoked, rings of saints, bones of martyrs, brought into ceremonies to lend spiritual weight to the fragile claim of purity. Historians still argue whether the Church was primarily safeguarding moral order or seizing yet another way to control women's lives. Some scholars believe confession offered a chance for mercy, a space where priests could absolve and protect women accused of impurity. Others argue it was surveillance disguised as sacrament, a way to gather information and keep parishioners in line. The truth, like candlelight, flickers between the two. Here's the quirky tidbit. In medieval Spain, some parish priests sprinkled holy water over bridal chambers, blessing not just the bed but the sheets, as though sanctity could seep into linen. In parts of rural France, relics of the Virgin Mary were passed over a bride's head before her wedding, the gesture believed to lock her purity in place until the vows were complete. Think of it as the world's most awkward bridal accessory. But the Church's role wasn't confined to rituals. Clerics wrote treatises cataloguing the signs of chastity, weaving theology into pseudo-medical claims. A hushed demeanor, pure, a bold laugh, suspicious, a blush. Potential evidence of shame. These categories became sermons, and sermons became social codes until women's behavior was passed with the intensity of Scripture itself. Imagine the pressure of kneeling before a priest, knowing that every word you confess might ripple through your household and beyond. Your silence could be judged as secrecy, your honesty as guilt. You weren't simply bearing your soul, you were bearing your family's honor, your dowry, your very future. And yet some women found clever ways to wield faith for themselves. In convents, nuns embraced virginity as a source of authority, claiming spiritual marriage to Christ that placed them outside the traditional marriage market. Their purity, though still a test, became a shield against unwanted unions. In their quiet cloisters, women turned the church's obsession into a sanctuary, rewriting the terms of purity on their own walls. So you linger in the glow of the chapel, hearing the rustle of robes, the creak of pews, the low murmur of prayers. For some, the church's role was suffocating surveillance. For others, it was a place of refuge. Either way, purity was never just between bride and groom. It was mediated by altars, relics, and whispered confessions that stretched far beyond the self. You might not expect marriage itself to come with a built-in loophole, but in some societies, trial marriages quietly allowed couples to test fertility and, by extension, purity, before anything was written in stone. Imagine a rustic village in medieval Scandinavia, the scent of pine smoke in the air, where two families gather in a longhouse not to celebrate a wedding, but to negotiate a kind of probationary partnership. The mainstream fact is that in several regions, from Norse communities to parts of the Germanic world, trial marriages or hand-fastings were recognized customs. Couples could live together for a year and a day, after which the union could either be ratified as permanent or dissolved without penalty. On the surface, it sounds surprisingly progressive, almost like medieval dating, but hidden within it was a sharp edge. These arrangements often functioned as covert purity and fertility tests. A woman who failed to conceive during the trial might be deemed barren, her purity questioned, and her prospects dimmed. Historians still argue whether these trial marriages were truly widespread, or if they were limited to frontier societies where strict church oversight was weaker. Some suggest the church tolerated them briefly before branding them sinful, while others argue they persisted underground for generations. What's undeniable is that for many women the experiment wasn't about choice, it was about being scrutinized under yet another lens of control. Here's the quirky tidbit. In certain Scottish Highland traditions, couples undergoing a trial marriage would mark their agreement by jumping over a broomstick together, a gesture later borrowed by other cultures. If the union failed, the couple simply jumped back in reverse. It sounds quaint and folkloric now, but back then it carried the weight of legitimacy or its loss. For women, the stakes were high. Imagine entering such a union knowing that your body was on silent trial. If you conceived, you might be declared fertile and thus untainted. If you didn't, whispers might spread, perhaps you weren't pure to begin with. The irony, of course, is that infertility could be the man's issue, but the verdict almost always fell on the woman. And trial marriages weren't always kind exits. Families sometimes treated them as traps. If a woman failed to please her partner during the year, she could be sent back to her parents' home with her reputation in tatters. No dowry, no protection, just the invisible scar of having failed the test. Picture the tension in those longhouses or cottages. The fire crackles, the couple sits side by side, and the whole village seems to lean in, waiting for outcomes that should have been private. For the man it was often an experiment. For the woman it was a verdict disguised as romance. And yet beneath the weight of custom you can hear quiet resistance. Some women, aware of the danger, sought protective charms, invoked saints, or relied on sympathetic midwives to shield them from judgment. A few even manipulated the terms, claiming pregnancy where none existed, or quietly ending the trial before suspicion could grow. Small acts of defiance in a system that otherwise turned love into litigation. So you drift through that imagined longhouse, the shadows of trial marriages flickering in the firelight. What was sold as freedom was, for women, often another form of testing. Purity wasn't just about first nights anymore. It was extended into months of scrutiny, a long audition where only one verdict mattered. You might not expect it, but while Europe staged river ordeals and bed inspections, other parts of the world devised their own rituals to enforce chastity. Imagine drifting through a Mughal palace in India, a Chinese imperial court, or a harem in the Middle East, where silk curtains sway and eunuchs keep watch. In each of these places, purity wasn't just a family matter, it was statecraft, enforced with tests as intricate as the embroidery on the gowns. The mainstream fact is this: in imperial China, concubines and brides destined for emperors were sometimes subjected to examinations by court officials or palace matrons. Purity was directly tied to legitimacy of heirs. A single rumor of prior intimacy could destabilize succession. Records from the Tang and Ming dynasties describe eunuchs, trusted precisely because of their perceived neutrality, charged with inspecting women, though the details of how are conveniently vague. What matters is that women's autonomy was again eclipsed by the throne's paranoia. In Mughal India, courtly culture mixed Persian, Islamic and Hindu traditions, creating elaborate systems of seclusion. The zenana, the women's quarters, was heavily guarded and entry was restricted. While the architecture itself became a purity test, some chronicles describe noble brides being monitored for signs of virginity before marriage alliances were sealed. Land, titles, and even provinces could hinge on those verdicts. Historians still argue whether these practices were routine or rare exceptions exaggerated in later retellings. Some scholars point out that many tests may have been symbolic or theatrical, designed to reassure anxious in-laws rather than truly confirm anything anatomical. Others suggest the sheer bureaucracy of royal households made purity inspections inevitable, a grim paperwork ritual disguised as morality. Here's the quirky tidbit: in Ottoman courts there were rumors of a ritual where a new concubine would be given a pomegranate to split. If the fruit spilled neatly, she was said to be chaste. If juice ran messily down her hands, suspicion followed. Was this ever real? Hard to say, but the symbolism of fruit, seeds, and stains shows how imagination eagerly filled in what science could not. Imagine the anxiety of being prepared for presentation in such a court. You're dressed in layers of silk painted with kohl, your hair braided with ribbons. Yet beneath the jewels and perfumes, you're terrified, not of the emperor's glance, but of the scrutiny of attendants who treat you like a ledger to be balanced. Every step, every gesture is read as a sign, your body transformed into a riddle for others to solve. And of course, the stakes weren't just personal, they were political. A concubine accused of impurity could be cast out, her family shamed, and her rivals elevated. Meanwhile, men of the court moved freely between wives, concubines, and mistresses with barely a raised eyebrow. The double standard stretched seamlessly across continents. So you linger in these palaces, hearing the shuffle of silk slippers, the clink of bangles, the low murmurs of attendants. Whether in Beijing, Delhi, or Istanbul, the pattern repeats. Women's purity was tested not for truth, but for power. It wasn't about whether you had lived a private life. It was about whether you could be displayed, certified, and claimed as part of dynastic machinery. You might not expect a battlefield to transform into a courtroom, yet for women in conquered lands, purity was often tested or violated as part of the spoils of war. Imagine standing amid the smoke of a razed village, soldiers still clanking in armor, while terrified women huddled together. The men boast of victory, but behind their laughter lies another cruel ritual, proving or disproving a captive's chastity. The mainstream fact is grim. Throughout history, invading armies treated women's bodies as extensions of conquest. In some cases, victors subjected captives to humiliating tests to see whether they were virgins, believing this marked them as valuable trophies. Chronicles from the Crusades mention prisoners inspected by clerics or midwives before being handed to lords. During Mongol invasions, young women were paraded before commanders, their purity assessed as though they were livestock. For the conquerors, women's chastity became another resource to seize. Historians still argue whether these tests were formalized procedures or ad hoc humiliations driven by soldiers' cruelty. Some accounts suggest they were systematic records of prisoners categorized by status. Others argue they were sporadic acts of violence, later exaggerated in chronicles. But either way, the women caught in them bore the shame, while the victors bragged of dominance. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some medieval campaigns, soldiers believed sleeping with a virgin could cure disease or grant good fortune in battle. The superstition was so widespread that commanders occasionally reserved captured virgins for themselves, fearing their men would squander the supposed blessing. The belief wasn't just cruel, it was absurd, treating purity like a battlefield talisman. Imagine the terror of being marched before strangers who pawed, prodded, or simply declared judgments without touching you at all. If you were deemed pure, you might be kept alive as a prize. If not, you could be cast aside, enslaved, or worse. There was no winning path, only different shades of suffering. And yet, stories survive of women resisting in small ways. Chronicles tell of captives smearing themselves with ash, mud, or even blood to appear unwell, hoping to be left alone. Others banded together, fabricating stories of betrothal or kinship to shield one another. It rarely worked, but in those acts you glimpse sparks of courage, faint but unextinguished. The cruel irony is that conquerors who obsessed over women's purity rarely worried about their own behavior. Soldiers boasted of defiling, commanders paraded their captives, and chroniclers recorded it all with a detached fascination. Women's virtue was turned into a prize, but the men's violence was normalized as inevitable. So you stand now in the fading smoke of those battlefields, listening to the clash of swords replaced by the murmur of fearful voices. Purity, once again, wasn't about morality, it was about ownership, humiliation, and the twisted logic of conquest. And as the haze drifts away, you realize the cruelest test of all wasn't a river or a sheet or a chalice. It was survival itself. You might not expect theatres and operas to echo the same cruel tests, but playwrights and poets loved nothing more than turning women's purity into spectacle. Imagine sitting in a candle-lit hall, velvet curtains drawn back, as actors stride onto the stage. The crowd leans forward, waiting for the scandal. A bride accused, a lover betrayed, and some elaborate proof of virginity paraded before the audience. Entertainment, in this case, was humiliation dressed up in rhyme and music. The mainstream fact is that purity tests became favourite motifs in European literature from the Renaissance onward. In Italian comedies, French farces, and Elizabethan plays, characters frequently schemed to prove or fake chastity. Shakespeare himself toyed with the theme. In Othello, Desdemona's supposed infidelity is proven by a misplaced handkerchief. In Much Ado About Nothing, Hero's honour is publicly destroyed by false accusations of impurity, her wedding halted until proof is staged. These plays reveal how easily purity became theatre, both literally and socially. Historians still argue whether audiences treated these plots as morality lessons or sheer entertainment. Some scholars suggest the plays reinforced the dangers of gossip and false judgment. Others believe crowds simply relished the drama, laughing or gasping at a woman's suffering on stage. Either way, the obsession with testing purity spilled from bedrooms and courtrooms onto the boards of public playhouses. Here's the quirky tidbit. In 18th century opera, composers wrote entire arias about chastity tests. In one comic opera, a bride drinks a truth potion on stage to prove her innocence, while the chorus belts out commentary. Imagine trying to hit a high note while pretending to swallow a cup of goat's milk laced with symbolism. Audiences roared with laughter, never mind the grim realities their jokes echoed. For women in the audience, the plays could cut close to home. Watching Hero faint on her wedding day in Much Ado About Nothing wasn't just entertainment, it was a reminder of how easily a whisper could ruin real lives. Men chuckled at bawdy jokes about tests, but women shifted uneasily, knowing their own reputations might one day face the same scrutiny. And yet theatre also offered sly resistance. Some playwrights wrote endings where the accusations were proven false, restoring the woman's honour and exposing male arrogance. Satirical verses mocked the absurdity of testing purity through sheets or potions, turning cruel rituals into parody. Literature mirrored society, but sometimes it also poked at its cracks. Imagine the atmosphere in one of those crowded halls. The audience laughs, gasps, or claps as actors toss around metaphors for virginity, while the chandeliers drip wax above them. Beneath the merriment, the message is clear. Purity is public business, fit to be debated, doubted, and displayed for applause. So you linger at the back of the theatre, the stage smoke curling toward you, realizing that even in art, women's chastity was rarely private. It was a plot device, a spectacle, a stage prop. And when the curtain fell, the echoes of those fictional tests followed women home, where the stakes were far from fictional. You might not expect scholars to argue over love poems and medical manuals with the same fervour, yet for centuries the question of whether science or romance could prove chastity stirred endless debate. Imagine yourself in a candlelit university hall, where robed physicians unroll parchment filled with anatomical diagrams, while in another corner of town, poets declaim verses about how a true maiden's blush can reveal her soul. Both claim authority, but neither has an ounce of proof. The mainstream fact is that by the Renaissance, virginity was discussed not only in courts and churches, but also in learned treatises. Physicians catalogued supposed physical signs, tightness, hymenal folds, complexion, even gait. At the same time, philosophers and poets argued that love itself could unveil purity. A true virgin, they claimed, had a certain aura, a glow of innocence that could not be faked. Science and romance both stumbled around the same myth, cloaking cultural obsession in different costumes. Historians still argue whether these medical manuals were genuinely believed or whether they served more as tools for anxious families seeking reassurance. Some scholars insist the physicians were deadly serious, publishing their lists of symptoms in Latin, complete with woodcut illustrations. Others argue they were more performative, half science, half theatre, meant to impress patrons rather than actually guide examinations. What's clear is that none of it worked, because virginity, of course, cannot be proven by anatomy or poetry. Here's the quirky tidbit. One 17th century physician claimed you could detect virginity by the way a girl urinated. If her stream was straight, she was pure. If it wavered, she was not. Meanwhile, a French poet of the same century insisted that the truest proof of maidenhood is found in the unbroken sweetness of her breath. Imagine being grilled about your bathroom habits or your halitosis as evidence of your chastity. It makes modern job interviews sound like a picnic. Picture the clash. Physicians in university halls strut about their diagrams, while poets at salons sing about roses, pearls, and snow to describe intact maidens. A nervous bride might be examined by one camp and serenaded by the other, her dignity shredded either way. For her, the debate wasn't academic, it was suffocating. And what about men? Their purity was almost never a question. Poets praised their passions, physicians studied their strength. If a man blushed, it was charming. If a woman blushed, it was dissected as a symptom. The scales tipped so heavily that it's a wonder they didn't topple the table. Yet there were moments of pushback. Some humanist thinkers began to question whether such tests made any sense. They hinted, carefully, that perhaps purity was a matter of behavior, not biology. Still, their voices were drowned out by the louder chorus of anxious families, ambitious doctors, and sentimental poets. So you linger in that imagined hall, hearing the echo of quills scratching and sonnets being recited. You realize purity was never simply medical or romantic. It was a stage on which both science and love performed clumsy acts. And as you drift away, the candlelight flickers, reminding you that no matter how they dressed it, whether in Latin or lyric, the test was always the same cruel illusion. You might not expect the obsession with purity to sail across oceans, but when Europeans colonized the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they carried their tests and taboos with them. Imagine a ship creaking through Atlantic waves, the salt stinging your nose, while in the captain's chest sits not just charts and compasses, but laws and customs ready to be planted in foreign soil. Among them, rules about women's chastity. The mainstream fact is that colonial administrators, missionaries, and settlers exported European purity codes wherever they went. In Spanish colonies, indigenous women who married conquistadors were often subjected to inspections by priests or midwives to verify virginity before their marriages were recognized. In British-controlled India, colonial courts wrestled with cases hinging on whether a bride was intact under English law, a grotesque clash between imported purity myths and local customs. Even in Puritan New England, young women could face whipping or fines if accused of premarital intimacy, their bodies judged as evidence in courts of law. Historians still argue whether colonial purity laws were more about controlling indigenous populations or about preserving European reputations abroad. Some suggest the obsession was intensified overseas, where colonizers felt anxious about maintaining moral superiority. Others argue purity tests functioned as tools of domination, another way to impose foreign power onto local women. Either way, the export of these practices turned them into global weapons. Here's the quirky tidbit. In 17th century Virginia, colonial courts actually recorded dowry disputes hinging on hymeneal evidence. One case bizarrely included a midwife's testimony that she could not vouch for the maid's untouched state, for she was too fond of dancing. In the Caribbean, meanwhile, enslaved women were forced through humiliating inspections under the guise of purity, though the real motive was controlling their reproductive labor. Purity wasn't really being tested, it was being weaponized. Picture the unease of indigenous brides brought into missions. They're dressed in stiff European gowns, veils tugged awkwardly over their heads, while priests murmur prayers about chastity in a language they barely understand. Families hover, knowing the union might secure protection or land, yet the woman herself has no voice in the process. Her body is a bridge between cultures, but also the battleground on which those cultures clash. And the irony, colonizers who demanded absolute purity from local women rarely lived by their own rules. European men took mistresses, enslaved women, and concubines freely, yet a whisper of impropriety about a local bride could ruin her entire community's standing with the colonial authorities. The hypocrisy was as wide as the ocean they crossed. So you drift with those ships into crowded harbors, hearing the mingled cries of merchants, sailors, and missionaries. In every port, purity tests arrive not as harmless traditions but as tools to reshape lives. And as the sails lower and the anchors drop, you realize the obsession with female chastity wasn't just a European quirk. It was exported, enforced, and carved into the foundations of new worlds, leaving scars that would outlast the empires themselves. You might not expect it, but just as there were genuine ordeals, there were also carefully staged fakes, proofs of purity manufactured behind closed doors. Imagine yourself standing in a quiet chamber at midnight, where candles gutter low, and a maid servant rushes in carrying a small vial of animal blood. A nervous bride waits, her reputation hanging by a thread, while her family conspires to create the illusion of evidence before dawn. The mainstream fact is that in many places counterfeit tests became an open secret. If a bride's family feared suspicion, they might prepare bedsheets with drops of pigeon blood or goat's blood, ensuring the morning display would satisfy prying eyes. Some women carried vials tucked into their sleeves, ready to spill them discreetly during their wedding night. Servants often became accomplices, bribed or sworn to secrecy. What was supposed to be proof of divine purity became a crude performance, staged for survival. Historians still argue whether these staged rituals were widespread or limited to desperate cases. Some suggest faked evidence was far more common than anyone admitted, pointing to folktales and court records full of suspiciously convenient outcomes. Others argue that while it happened, the risk of being caught was so high that many families avoided it. After all, if a false sheet was discovered, the scandal could be worse than the original rumor. Here's the quirky tidbit. In parts of Eastern Europe, brides sometimes used sponges soaked in blood hidden under their gowns. One 17th century anecdote tells of a bride who panicked mid-ceremony and dropped her sponge on the floor, only for her quick-thinking maid to stomp on it, pretending it was a beetle. The crowd laughed, the moment passed, and the marriage stood. History doesn't record whether the beetle survived. The staging didn't end at sheets. Some families swore elaborate oaths, forging testimonies from midwives who hadn't actually conducted examinations. Others whispered agreements with grooms who, out of affection or fear of scandal, pretended satisfaction. Purity, in these moments, was less a truth than a negotiated fiction, a collaborative play where everyone agreed not to question the props. But for the women themselves, the stress was enormous. Imagine lying awake in that chamber, knowing your future depended not on who you were, but on whether a stain looked convincing. Your body wasn't your own. It was a canvas to be painted with lies, and you had no choice but to let others hold the brush. And sometimes the schemes unraveled. Court records tell of annulments where grooms accused brides of faking evidence, dragging servants into testimony. One tale from Venice describes a groom who noticed the bloodstain was too perfectly round. His suspicion led to an annulment, financial ruin for the bride's family, and humiliation in the city's piazzas. The stage curtain fell, but the audience wasn't forgiving. So you linger in that flickering chamber, hearing the hurried whispers, seeing the glint of a glass vial, the smudge of red on white linen. The performance is fragile, desperate, and full of risk. Yet it reveals something important. Purity wasn't just tested, it was counterfeited, negotiated, and bartered. Another layer of cruelty in a system where truth mattered less than appearances. You might not expect it, but even as the 20th century dawned, with radios buzzing, trains roaring, and science reshaping the world, old purity tests still lingered like stubborn ghosts. Imagine a clinic in the 1920s, white walls, metal instruments gleaming under electric lights, where a young bride sits nervously. A doctor, clipboard in hand, prepares to conduct what he calls a virginity examination. The setting feels modern, but the script is medieval. The mainstream fact is that virginity exams persisted well into the modern era. In parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, medical professionals were enlisted to confirm a bride's intact state before marriage. Even armies got involved. During the Second World War, some military recruiters in Eastern Europe examined female recruits under the guise of purity. In countries across the globe, from India to Latin America, police forces and courts sometimes demanded such tests in cases of rape or morality trials. It wasn't just folklore anymore, it was institutionalized. Historians still argue whether these practices were remnants of superstition or deliberate tools of control cloaked in modern medicine. Some see them as proof of tradition refusing to die. Others argue they were repackaged for new institutions, a way of disciplining women under the guise of science. Either way, the tests revealed nothing, but they carried enormous weight. Here's the quirky tidbit. In 1960s Morocco, police manuals reportedly included instructions on virginity testing for women accused of sex work, listing signs like the firmness of the vaginal wall. Meanwhile, in Turkey, some brides were sent to hospitals before weddings for official certificates of virginity, a piece of paper presented almost like a diploma of purity. Imagine framing that above the mantel. Picture the humiliation of these moments. A girl sits in a clinic, sterile smell burning her nose, strangers prodding while her family waits outside for the verdict. Her dignity dissolves under fluorescent lights, just as it had once dissolved under candlelight. Modernity didn't erase the cruelty, it simply dressed it in lab coats. And the persistence wasn't only in clinics, folklore adapted too. In parts of rural America, brides were still pressured to display proof on wedding night sheets well into the early 1900s. Anthropologists recorded similar customs in remote villages across Africa and Asia, where elders gathered to inspect cloths as though centuries hadn't passed. The obsession was too convenient, too deeply rooted in control to fade overnight. Imagine being a young woman in 1950, flipping through glossy magazines that promised glamour and freedom, while your family whispered behind closed doors about medical exams before your marriage. The modern world dangled promises of independence, yet old shadows still followed. So you linger in that sterile clinic, hearing the scratch of pens on charts, the echo of boots in military halls, the whispers of families outside waiting for certificates. Virginity tests, absurd and unscientific, trudged on into the age of radios and automobiles. They proved nothing, but they carried power, reminding women that even in a modern world, ancient obsessions could still dictate their lives. You might not expect it, but long before hashtags and feminist essays, there were women writing furious critiques of purity itself. Imagine a salon in the 18th century, candles dripping wax, pens scratching across parchment, as a sharp-eyed woman declares that virginity is not a treasure, but a trap. Her words slice through the smoky air, scandalizing the gentleman sipping wine in the corner. The mainstream fact is that from the Renaissance onward, writers, especially women, began questioning the entire system of purity tests. Thinkers like Christine de Pizan, in her Book of the City of Ladies, 1405, argued that women's worth was not defined by chastity, but by virtue, intelligence, and contribution to society. By the 19th and 20th centuries, feminist voices grew louder. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft railed against the hypocrisy of demanding chastity from women while excusing male indulgence. Later, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, 1949, tore apart the myth that a woman's value was sealed in her virginity. Historians still argue whether these critiques genuinely shifted social practice or remained mostly intellectual exercises. Some suggest they laid the groundwork for later reforms, planting seeds of skepticism in educated circles. Others argue the grip of purity culture was too strong, and for ordinary women, these essays offered little escape. Still, the very act of questioning chipped away at the edifice. Here's the quirky tidbit. One French satirist in the 17th century wrote a mock guidebook for proving virginity, complete with absurd steps like, ask her to yawn, if her tongue is pink, she is pure. It was a joke, of course, but it lampooned the ridiculousness of the real test so well that church authorities tried to suppress it. Even satire was dangerous when it threatened to expose purity as performance. Picture the courage it took for women to speak out. A pamphlet circulated in a coffee house could ruin reputations. A bold essay might invite exile. Yet some persisted, penning arguments that purity was a cage built to keep women obedient. They pointed out the obvious double standard. Men were praised for conquest, women condemned for consent. Imagine a young woman reading Wollstonecraft by candlelight, realizing for the first time that her worth wasn't tied to a sheet or a scarlet whisper. For her, the critique wasn't just words on a page, it was oxygen, a chance to breathe beyond the suffocating weight of surveillance. And, slowly, voices multiplied. By the 20th century, women marched, wrote, and organized, reframing purity not as a test, but as a myth to dismantle. They demanded that dignity and equality, not anatomy, determine value. So you linger in that imagined salon, hearing the steady scratch of pens and the rise of defiant laughter. For centuries, purity was enforced by torches, chalices, and contracts. But here, in ink and argument, women began the slow work of tearing the myth apart, word by word. You might not expect modern science to wade into this murky arena, but eventually doctors and researchers began dismantling the very foundation of purity tests. Imagine stepping into a 20th century lecture hall, chalk dust in the air, where a physician sketches diagrams on a blackboard. No incense, no relics, no gossiping matrons, just cold facts finally brought to bear on centuries of myths. The mainstream fact is clear. By the mid-20th century, medical research had proven what women had always known, that virginity cannot be tested. The hymen varies wildly in shape and resilience, sometimes absent from birth, sometimes flexible enough to stretch without tearing. Exercise, horseback riding, or simple daily activity could alter it. In other words, no single physical sign could prove chastity. Leading medical associations eventually declared virginity testing to be meaningless and harmful. Historians still argue whether this scientific clarity was embraced quickly or resisted stubbornly. Some countries adopted reforms early, removing virginity exams from law. Others clung to them well into the 21st century, using medical language to justify old practices. Change came unevenly, proving that evidence alone doesn't always topple tradition. Here's the quirky tidbit. In the 1960s, a few doctors still insisted on offering virginity certificates. One Dutch physician even advertised them in newspapers, claiming they provided reassurance for anxious grooms. Meanwhile, women quietly mocked the whole ordeal. One feminist magazine published a spoof certificate with the bold headline, "Certified Unicorn, Proof of Purity." The satire stung precisely because the practice was still so absurdly common. Picture the relief and the frustration of women hearing science confirm the obvious. Relief, because at last someone with authority said, "The test is nonsense." Frustration, because families and governments were slow to let go. A girl might sit in a clinic listening to a doctor explain that her hymen proved nothing, only to leave and face relatives demanding the same proof anyway. Truth struggled to penetrate centuries of myth, and yet cracks widened. Feminist health movements in the 1970s circulated pamphlets debunking virginity myths, teaching women about their own anatomy. Universities taught sex education that moved beyond morality to biology. Slowly, the narrative shifted from testing purity to questioning why purity had ever mattered in the first place. Imagine yourself sitting in that lecture hall as chalk squeaks across the board. The doctor erases the old diagrams of seals and barriers, replacing them with notes about elasticity and natural variation. You feel that the weight of centuries lifting slightly, though not entirely gone. Outside the hall, society still whispers, but inside the science is clear. Purity tests are meaningless. So you drift away from that room of chalk and fact, realizing that even when myths are shattered, their shadows linger. The cruel tests may have been proven false, but their echoes remained loud, reminding you that knowledge alone cannot undo fear overnight. You might not expect governments to step in so late, but laws against virginity testing didn't emerge until recent decades, centuries after the cruelty began. Imagine a modern courtroom with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, stacks of legal briefs on polished desks, and a judge leaning forward to declare that an ancient ritual is finally, officially, illegal. The room feels sterile, but the decision carries the weight of countless silenced voices. The mainstream fact is this: by the early 21st century, international organizations like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and Amnesty International condemned virginity testing as unscientific, degrading, and a violation of human rights. Several countries, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Afghanistan, and many others, have faced pressure to ban the practice outright. Some did, codifying laws that forbid doctors, police, or families from demanding exams. Others resisted, citing cultural values or simply ignoring the bans in practice. Historians still argue whether legal bans have teeth. Some say they represent genuine progress, a sign that societies are finally confronting the harm caused by these rituals. Others insist laws on paper mean little when communities continue the tests in secret, or when courts still accept evidence rooted in old myths. The tension lies between legislation and lived reality. Here's the quirky tidbit. In 2019, the American state of Michigan passed a law banning doctors from performing virginity tests after a high-profile case involving a father who bragged about taking his daughter for annual checks. The law was both serious and surreal. Imagine lawmakers in the 21st century spending time debating whether a medieval myth should still be allowed in clinics. And yet, that was necessary because echoes of the practice persisted even in supposedly modern societies. Picture the relief of women's rights activists who fought for decades to have these tests outlawed. They rallied, protested, published reports, and met in cramped offices with stacks of affidavits from survivors. Each signature on a petition carried the weight of stories too painful to repeat. For them, the law wasn't just legalese, it was vindication, proof that their voices could finally reshape policy. But the bans often collided with tradition. In some regions, communities kept testing brides before weddings, even if the law forbade it. Families whispered about arranging private doctors or trusted midwives. For many women, the law felt distant, while the fear of gossip remained immediate. Legal reforms can outlaw cruelty, but they can't outlaw suspicion. And yet the momentum matters. Each country that bans virginity testing sends a signal: purity is no longer state business. Slowly, the narrative shifts from silence to accountability, from whispered rumors to public rejection of an outdated ordeal. So you linger in that courtroom, hearing the finality of the gavel as it echoes across centuries. For the first time, the cruelty of purity tests is not just debated, it is condemned by law. And as you step back into the quiet corridors, you realize that while justice comes late, its arrival still carries the power to reshape the future. You might not expect it, but even after laws, protests, and science have swept away the old myths, the scars of purity culture remain etched deep into society. Imagine sitting in a quiet living room today, the hum of a ceiling fan above, where a grandmother leans forward to warn her granddaughter not to ruin herself before marriage. The words may be gentler now, but the pressure feels just as heavy as it did centuries ago. The mainstream fact is that purity culture still lingers in many parts of the world. In conservative communities, virginity is tied to family honor, and women face stigma if they are suspected of sexual activity before marriage. Even in places where virginity testing is banned, surveys reveal that families still pressure doctors or midwives to perform them in secret. Modern pop culture, from soap operas to internet forums, often reinforces the idea that a woman's worth is tied to chastity, showing just how stubborn the obsession is. Historians still argue whether purity culture survives mainly because of religion, tradition, or simple inertia. Some scholars point to conservative religious teachings that still equate virginity with holiness. Others argue it's about power, families and communities holding on to control of women's bodies as a way to preserve order. Either way, the obsession hasn't vanished, it has simply changed shape. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, clinics quietly sell artificial hymen kits, tiny capsules that release red dye when broken, creating the illusion of blood on wedding night sheets. The product, sold online, comes with instructions discreetly slipped into the package. Imagine ordering a piece of proof with next-day delivery. A medieval ritual rebranded by e-commerce. The scars run deeper than rituals, though. Women raised under purity culture often describe lasting anxiety, shame, and fear around intimacy. They carry memories of whispered warnings, threats of disgrace, or even medical exams that proved nothing but left them humiliated. For many, the real test never ended. It became an internal voice reminding them that their value was conditional. Imagine the frustration of a young student hearing a teacher lecture about saving yourself, while her male classmates grin, knowing the same rules don't apply to them. Or the unease of a bride-to-be who trusts her partner but fears her in-laws' questions. Even in societies that claim to be modern, echoes of the past still police women's choices. And yet voices of resistance grow louder. Writers, activists, and everyday women share their stories, dismantling the myths one confession at a time. Documentaries expose the cruelty of virginity tests. Social media campaigns reclaim language once used to shame. In the laughter of women mocking purity myths online, you hear the beginnings of healing. So you linger in that living room, the ceiling fan humming, the grandmother's words fading into the background. The granddaughter nods politely, but knows better. The chain of obsession weakens link by link. The scars may remain, but scars tell stories. And sometimes, stories are the first step toward change. You might not expect it, but after all the ordeals, rivers, sheets, potions, and lies, the most powerful act women performed was reclaiming dignity itself. Imagine walking now into a bright hall filled not with priests or physicians, but with women's voices, students debating, activists chanting, artists painting bold canvases that refuse shame. The air hums with a different kind of judgment, not about who is pure, but about who has the courage to live freely. The mainstream fact is this: in recent decades, women's movements around the globe have reshaped the conversation. Feminist scholars dismantled purity myths in books and classrooms. Activists in countries from Kenya to India fought to end virginity testing, framing it as a violation of human rights. Medical associations worldwide officially declared that virginity cannot be proven. Where once a young woman might have been forced into humiliating trials, she can now point to science, law, and community support as shields. Historians still argue whether the obsession with purity is truly ending or simply mutating into new forms. Some believe society is finally breaking free. Others caution that myths adapt, slipping into subtler pressures about modesty, reputation, or respectability. But either way, women are no longer silent. Their stories are reshaping the narrative. Here's the quirky tidbit. In the 21st century, some women's groups host unvirginity ceremonies, where participants tear up symbolic bedsheets, laugh over old myths, and toast with champagne. What was once a source of fear becomes satire, celebration, even healing. The sheets once paraded in shame are now props in parody skits, proof that dignity can be reclaimed not just with arguments, but with joy. Picture the contrast. Centuries ago, a bride trembled at dawn, knowing her sheet would be inspected. Now, a young woman posts online, mocking the same ritual with hashtags and memes. History's cruel tests dissolve in laughter, and the power once wielded against her turns hollow. And so, as you drift gently out of this long, weary story, you realize that purity tests were never about truth, they were about control. They stole dignity but never fully silenced it. Women endured, resisted, and finally rewrote the script. Now the hall grows quieter, the voices softening into whispers. The cruel weight of history recedes, replaced by the steady rhythm of resilience. You're left not with the sting of injustice, but with the warmth of defiance and renewal. Let the pace slow now, like footsteps easing along a quiet lane at dusk. The sharp edges of history blur into the softer lines of memory. You've walked through centuries of trials, accusations, and humiliations, and though the stories were heavy, they carry you toward calm understanding. Imagine yourself resting now in a gentle room, curtains swaying with a late evening breeze. The fires of ordeal are long extinguished, the rivers still, the courtrooms silent. All the sheets, the chalices, the shackles, faded relics left behind in dusty halls. What lingers instead is the sound of breathing, steady, safe, and free. Your thoughts drift like leaves on water. You see the women of the past not in their pain, but in their strength, their eyes meeting yours across centuries. They whisper that you are more than any test, more than any rumor, more than any myth. Their burdens are no longer yours to carry. The room darkens into twilight. Shadows stretch long and soft, and the weight of judgment lifts from your shoulders. All that remains is quiet, the kind that wraps gently around you, the kind that asks nothing, proves nothing, demands nothing. Take a slow breath, let it fill you like light, spilling into a still chapel. Exhale, and with it, release the voices of accusers, the quills scratching verdicts, the murmurs of crowds. They fade until only silence remains, and in that silence, you are whole. No tests, no trials, just rest. So close your eyes, sink deeper into the calm, and let sleep take you gently. The story has ended, and tomorrow waits with softer roads.